Well, as we continue our series, Grace is Greater, our theme verse is found in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, verse 15. It says, "See to it that no one misses the grace of God." And that's a heartbeat of this whole series. And truthfully, it's the heartbeat of this church. You know, when you think about it, we don't want anyone to miss the grace of God. I mean, that's the point of why we gather every week, is that we would all be reminded if we've forgotten, and we would learn for the first time if we never knew it before, that the grace of God is greater than anything that we would ever experience in this life. It's easy at times for us to find ourselves trying to replace the grace of God with some cheap imitations. Some people try to replace the grace of God with simple religion. And to be honest with you, we're not big fans of religion around here. Religion is that set of rules or rituals that you kind of go through. You don't even have to engage your mind at times to do it. And we think that if we do those things, that somehow it's going to replace the grace of God. Because if we do those things, somehow we earn God's favor. But I've got to be honest with you, it never works. It just doesn't work. We're completely dependent on God's grace if we're going to be successful in this journey walking with Him. So this series, we've been focusing on what I was calling for a couple of weeks now, we've been calling an equation. But we have a PhD in mathematics that goes to church here, and he told me last week it's not an equation, it's an inequality. Because one side is greater than the other. And so we want to look at an inequality. Last thing I want to do is offend a smart guy, right? No, he was gracious about it, but we had a good laugh, and I looked dumber than I normally do around him. We have this new inequality we want to look at, that grace is greater than weakness. Grace is greater than weakness. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Nathan talked about how grace is greater than our mistakes and how God forgives our sins and our mistakes and our failures. And He even comes along and He will eliminate the guilt that goes along with all of that. And then last week, we looked at how grace is greater than our hurts. And that seemed to really strike a chord with a number of Northeasters last week, because we recognize that grace really isn't grace if it's just received. It has to be given away as well. And we find that when we give grace away, there's an amazing freedom that comes. Grace is greater than our hurts. Well, today we want to look at the inequality of grace is greater than our weaknesses. If you have your Bible and want to turn with me to 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, Paul's going to challenge this church in Corinth in a letter to not celebrate in strength or accomplishments, but to celebrate in their weaknesses, because weakness gives a basis for God's grace to work. That's where God's power can be more visibly demonstrated. Now, there's a couple things that you probably need to know, at least it'll help you to understand about the city of Corinth. You see, Corinth was a destination city. It was a lot like today, the cities of Chicago or Los Angeles or New York. It was places in that region that people just went to. You know, it was a location that you would arrive at, or not something you were passing through, but a place you were headed to. And the reason for that was, if you went there, you would experience the culture of the city. You would also, yeah, okay. You would also recognize that they were known for, if you visited, they were known for their luxurious lifestyle, for their impressive architecture, and they were also a center of their elite socialites. They lived there. So that's kind of where the famous people, the popular people would gather. It was a place of pleasure and exotic living and extravagant buildings. Corinth was a place that placed a lot of value and a lot on strength, education, and accomplishments. So Paul writes a letter to him. It's what we call 1 Corinthians. It was his first letter. And then he writes this letter. It's the second letter to him. But in between those two letters, a group of false teachers have come on the scene, and they are starting to win the people away from the church. They are trying to recruit people away from this church. They're showing their religious resumes by saying, hey, look what I have done. Look what I have accomplished. And they're going through their religious experiences, and the people in the church are beginning to be won over to this group of false teachers. And Paul finds himself in an interesting predicament because Paul, in his own right, has this incredibly impressive resume. I mean, if you were to roll it all out, you would go, that dude is spiritual. I mean, if you looked at all that, you would look at that. So he could just use his resume and he could just explain to them, hey, if you want serious spiritual resume, then I can give you that to you. And therefore, he could just win the people back based upon that. But the problem is, Paul doesn't want the church to be based on or have these people won back to a series of human strengths, human accomplishments, and human wisdom, even if they're couched in the context of spirituality or a religious resume. He wants the church to delight in weakness so that they can experience God's power. He wants them to delight in their weaknesses. So in those moments when they can only do this, but they need this much done, that God has to show up. And when God shows up, they recognize this wasn't them. This was God. He wants them to enjoy that. He wants them to experience that. Well, that's a similar challenge for us today. It's a challenge for us today because we live in a place that's a lot like Corinth. We live in a culture where we put a ton of emphasis on strength and abilities and accomplishments and self-reliance. That's what we value. That's what we celebrate. That's what we strive for. And Paul, in this letter, is going to flip this whole thing around for us. And he's going to say what you should delight in is not your strengths. The strengths are good, but that's not where we find our delight. That's not where we're going to celebrate. He says, celebrate in your weaknesses. Celebrate in your weaknesses. Of course, a weak person, Paul recognizes he can't just come out and say, celebrate your weaknesses. Because if he looks weak, then the people will go, well, yeah, naturally you're going to say celebrate your weaknesses because you're weak, right? So what Paul does, much against probably his own personal kind of experience and personal process that he's already done numerous times, this goes against the grain of all that he stands for. Paul's going to start to unveil his own personal resume, spiritually speaking. What he's going to do is he's going to say, hey, here are the standards that you respect. Here's all the stuff that you take value in, and I am in spades on all of that. And then he's going to take it and he's going to set it aside and say, but this isn't what we should focus on. Here's my weaknesses, and this is where I find my greatest strengths. He'll say it's really weakness that we should be celebrating. So take a look at verse 21 and following in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter. It says, whatever anyone else dares to boast about. Now, I'm going to interrupt us a minute here, but he's talking about these false teachers coming in and saying, look around, look at how impressive we are. He says, whatever they dare to brag about, whatever they dare to boast about, he said, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast about. Okay, now he's saying, I'm out of my mind. I can't believe that I'm about to say what I'm about to say, but whatever the case is, whatever they say about themselves, I can say that about myself also. That's what he's saying here. And then he goes on with his list. He says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? And then I love this. It's kind of, he's thinking out loud. He says, I am out of my mind to talk like this. This is not who I am. But in order to win their respect, he has to prove that he is on the same level as these false teachers. It's so unlike Paul. His whole approach to ministry was not to elevate himself ever. It was always to elevate Christ. So the best shot he has to elevate Christ is to show them his own personal successes. He says, I am out of my mind to talk like this. But he's making the case for their value system, that his background and his heritage and his passion and his experience are all very impressive. He goes on in the first verses of chapter 12, if you want to look down there, he says, this boasting will do no good, but I will go on. I will reluctantly tell of my visions and revelations from the Lord. I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside of my body. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise, and I heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. That experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. But this is the coolest story. Think about this for a second. He says, listen, 14 years ago, I was caught up in the third heaven. Not the first heaven, not the second heaven, but the third heaven. I don't know what that is, but it's part of heaven, okay? He doesn't even know how he got there. Was he there in the flesh or was he there in a vision? He doesn't know. But he saw things and he experienced things and he heard things that no human can repeat. Now, let me say this. He just mentions it in passing so he can say, I had the experience, but I'm not going to tell you any more about it. And it's been 14 years. Let me tell you something. If Monty goes to the third heaven, you're going to hear about it next Sunday, okay? Now, I may be bound by some of the things, but I'd be mentioning it. You know what I'm saying? It's going to be the next series. We're going to interrupt whatever. No, grace is greater. No, we're going to talk about the third heaven, okay? If I'm there, I'm going to be Instagramming and tweeting from the third heaven, okay? Hashtag third heaven. Just watch for it, okay? If you see it pop up, you'll know. Monty's in the third heaven. Hey, I'm going to write a book. I don't have any desire to write a book, but if I go to the third heaven, I'm writing a book. And it's going to be my experience in the third heaven, right? And I promise you, if we have a conversation, I'm always going to mention, oh, yes, I understand. When I was in the third heaven, I'm going to weave it's all going to come right back to the third heaven, right? It's going to be on my resume. If I'm introduced to speak somewhere, they're going to mention the fact, back from the third heaven, our speaker today, Monty Wilkinson. The deal is that I'm going to make it part of who I am on a regular basis. If I had had an experience like that, obviously you're getting this picture that Paul and I are very different. But Paul's taken 14 years, and then he only mentions it here. He just brings it up and says that it happened, but I'm not going to talk about it. Instead, Paul's tendency is to reference himself as a slave. He's not drawing attention to himself. He always puts himself in the context of being a slave. Now, a slave is not known by their resume or their heritage because they're a slave. A slave is only known for one thing, and that is who their master is. Paul says, that's all you need to know about me, is that I'm a servant of Jesus. Nothing else is important. His education, he was educated by Gamaliel. This was a brilliant, impressive school of learning. He had all the right credentials, and he knows it. He knows that it would have been easy for him to be very proud and to find his own personal confidence in all of these strengths. But instead, Paul goes on to talk about something that he refers to as his thorn in the flesh. You've probably heard a reference to this along the way if you've been around church any length of time at all. This was a weakness that he has so that he will be dependent on God. Look at verses 7 and 8. This is what Paul writes. He says, so to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and to keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged to the Lord to take it away. Now, there's lots of speculation as to what this thorn might be. There are different thoughts about this as to who it was or what it was, or what we just don't know. But what we do know is that it's significant. It's very significant. In fact, I'm sure he asked God numerous times, but we know that on 3 occasions he begged God. He pleaded with God that he would take this away, and God doesn't. He is weeping and begging God to remove it, and God says no. How many of us have had something in our lives where we have said, Lord, if you just take this away, I'd be more effective. I really would. I'd be a better part of the body of God. I don't know what it is for you, this thorn, this weakness that you've asked God to change or heal or take away, and He hasn't. You may find a little bit of a connection with the Apostle Paul in this series, and that's a good place to be. Paul calls this a messenger from Satan. He recognizes that this is from Satan, but he also acknowledges that God could take it away if He wanted to. So if it's from Satan, but God allows it, that's a helpful view for us as we experience, thorns in our own lives. Satan sends it, but God can remove it. So the big question is, why didn't God remove it? Well, Paul gets his answer in verses 9 and 10. It says, each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weakness. He doesn't have to ask God to remove the thorn anymore. Paul actually steps into the weakness and he takes pleasure in it because he knows that's where God's power is. And in the insults, he goes on, he says, in the insults, hardships, persecution, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. Why is he doing that? He says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. He's saying that he used to beg God to take away this weakness, this thorn, but he doesn't anymore because he understands that this thorn in his flesh, that he would have done anything to get rid of, is where he experiences God's grace most powerfully in his life now. The very thing that we have scorned may be the very portal for God's grace to flow into our lives and to work. That's where God's power works best. If that's where God's power works best, then you and I, we need to celebrate our weaknesses. But let's be honest, right? That's hard to do. We don't celebrate our weaknesses very well, not in this culture. We're all about strength and success. In fact, we tend to run away from our weaknesses, to live in denial of them. Paul says, take pleasure in them. If you take pleasure in your weaknesses, that's where you will meet God most powerfully. That's where God will meet you. So in the time that we have left this morning, I want us to look at a few areas of vulnerability to help us to better understand grace that's found in our weaknesses. How God pours that in to those areas where He fills in the gaps where we are incapable or insufficient. The first inequality, you with me? I learned. The first inequality I want us to look about that illustrates this vulnerability is grace is greater than our infirmities. Grace is greater than our infirmities. This idea of thorn, the word that's used here, is not the idea of a thorn off of a rose bush. It's actually translated, if it's more literal, it would mean a stake or a spear. The idea of this thorn in the flesh isn't just an annoying itch that Paul can't reach. This is a serious, significant problem. It's keeping him from being who he wants to be. It's keeping him from doing what he believed God has called him to do to the very best of his ability. So he made his case and he begged God, please take this thorn away from me so I can be more effective in what you've called me to do. And God says, nope, Paul, it's actually better if you're weak. Because if you're weak, then there is some space there for me to demonstrate my strength in your life. Some think that the thorn that Paul struggled with was a sin that he battled, that he just couldn't get over. But the word that's used here is thorn in the flesh, which indicates that it's a physical infirmity. Now, there are a number of theories about what this was. The first theory was that Paul was somehow suffering from some type of deformity. You know, Paul was, by his own definition, unattractive due to the beatings that he had suffered. Can you imagine? He'd been beaten so many times that his face was somewhat disfigured. I imagine it had maybe some part to look like a prize fighter. He had the scars. He had the deformity. He references this in chapter 10. Paul indicated that his appearance was an obstacle for people to receiving the gospel because they were distracted by the way that he looked. And some think that that was his thorn in the flesh. There's another idea that Paul was epileptic. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. One of the pagan ideas of that time was that people who had epilepsy were actually possessed by a demonic spirit. And in Galatians, there is one reference where Paul thanks the church in Galatia for not spitting on him. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, people of that day thought that if you had a demonic spirit, they would spit on you. That was the way that they reacted to people. And Paul said, hey, thanks for not spitting on me, which leads some people to believe that Paul suffered from epilepsy. But probably the best example or assessment, if you will, of what Paul's thorn was probably that Paul suffered from some kind of problem with his eyes. There are a number of people who thought this. Most noteworthy of a explanation is found in Galatians, the 6th chapter, verse 11. He says that he's writing in his own hand. Now, we know that Paul dictated his letters. But here he says in verse 11 of chapter 6, the end of that letter to the church in Galatia, he says, you'll notice I'm writing in my own hand because of the large letters. And that causes a number of folks to think that Paul probably has got a problem with his eyes. That's why he's writing so big. And if he had a problem with his vision, doing what he did would have been a significant challenge for him. And the truth is, we don't know for sure. There are others who think he suffered from migraines, stomach problems, or maybe even a speech impediment. But regardless of that, all these different theories, the truth is, Paul never actually identifies it. And I think there's two reasons why. The same reason he didn't tell us that he was caught up in the third heaven until 14 years later is probably the reason he doesn't go into all the detail about his thorn in the flesh. Paul doesn't want to make this about Paul. This is not about him. He doesn't want to draw any more attention to him. So he mentions the thorn, just like he mentions the trip to the third heaven, and then he's off of it. There's probably another possibility, and that is that he knows there is great value in this metaphor. That this metaphor of a thorn in the flesh, that picture that people will have, without describing exactly what it is, all they have is that picture. And that's going to be helpful to us, especially when you and I face a thorn in the flesh. Whatever your thorn is that you have, you can examine it through the lens that Paul gives us, that God's grace is sufficient for you. Whatever physical challenge you're facing now, or whatever physical challenge you'll face sometime into the future, you will know God's grace is more than enough. God's grace is more than our infirmities. God's grace is more than our inabilities. Now, when we hear the word weakness, we always seem to associate it with our talents or our abilities. We don't have what it takes to get the job done. It's kind of the idea when we talk about inabilities. So you go to a job interview. Has this ever happened to you? And one of the questions during the interview is, what's your greatest weakness? You're going, I don't want to tell them my greatest weakness, right? Because they might not hire me. You know? So what do? Well, we try to come up with something that sounds like a weakness, but actually, if you think about it, it's really a strength. You know, my favorite example of this is Michael Scott, you know, the Steve Carell character from The Office. He was asked this question, and his response was, I love too much. I love that. You know, I just love too much. You know, what is your greatest weakness? We take something that's actually a strength and we make it sound like a weakness. Because we're wired up. We disguise our weaknesses. We announce our strengths and we put all of our confidence in them. We don't let people see where we're struggling. There is confidence in our strengths in this culture, but there isn't in our weaknesses. In fact, there was a business book that came out several years ago. It was called Strengths Finder. Some of you may have have got that book, have gotten that book. And what you will find in there is a system that will help you to discover your top 5 strengths. They do all this big assessment, and it's analyzed, and then they shoot you this list that tells you what your strengths are. And that's helpful in business, and it makes us feel good. But if Paul were recommending a book, he would recommend Weaknesses Finder. He wants us to look at and identify the areas in our life where we're weak. There's areas where we knock it out of the park all the time, but what are the areas where we have some inabilities? Our talents aren't that great. Where are those areas? That's where God has the opportunity to demonstrate His power. And instead of celebrating our strengths, I'm going to celebrate my weaknesses, because that's where God's grace is going to meet me most significantly. But I'll be honest with you, that's hard to do. It's hard for me to do. And it just goes against what is most natural for all of us, isn't it? But Paul calls us to spend a little bit of time right there and recognize that God can work in that moment. Well, the final vulnerability I want us to look at, the final inequality, is grace is greater than our insecurities. Grace is greater than our insecurities. There's a story from the book A Tramp for the Lord by Corrie ten Boom, where she tells the story about a woman that she had met in Russia during the Cold War. This was a time when Christians were being persecuted very heavily. They were spied upon, they were investigated, and they were being punished for just being Christians and actually promoting the gospel. And Corrie writes in this book about a lady that she met. I just want to read to you a part of this story. It says, the old woman was lying on a small sofa, propped up by pillows. Her body was bent and twisted, almost beyond recognition. It was by the dread disease of multiple sclerosis. Her aged husband spent all this time caring for her since she was unable to move off the sofa. I walked across the room and kissed her wrinkled cheek, Corrie writes. She tried to look up, but the muscles in her neck were so atrophied that she could only roll her eyes upward and smile. She raised her right hand slowly. It jerks. There was only one part of her body she could control. It was the index finger on her right hand. So with this one finger, she would type. All day, every day, and often far into the night, she would be found typing. She wasn't just typing, though. She was translating the Bible and Christian books into Russian. Her husband hovered close by and explained to me that sometimes it takes a long time for her finger to hit the right key. Corrie ten Boom said that as she looked at her wasted form on the sofa, her head pulled down and her feet curled back under her body, Corrie thought, "Oh Lord, why don't you heal her?" I cried inwardly for her. Her husband, sensing my anguish deep in my soul, gave this answer: God has a purpose in her sickness. Every other Christian in the city is being watched by the secret police. But because she's been sick so long, no one ever looks in on her. They leave us alone. And she's the only one in all the city who can type quietly, undetected by the police. You think about that for a second. If you and I saw that woman, we would not be impressed with her strengths, not at all. You might even feel sorry for her. You might have pity for her, but isn't it interesting that the one thing that seems to be destroying her is the one thing that God is using most powerfully in her life? Maybe it's a physical illness that you struggle with. Maybe it's a lack of having what it takes to get the job done. But whatever the thorn is that creates the space, and the result is this experience that you have with God's grace and His power in your life when you recognize that thorn. Here's an important point. To the extent to which we are able to experience the power of God's grace is in direct proportion to the extent to which I recognize my own weakness. Let me say that one more time. The extent to which we are able to experience the power of God's grace is in direct proportion to the extent in which I recognize my own weakness. I only receive the amount of grace to which I acknowledge and delight in my own weakness. It doesn't work if we deny our weaknesses. Many of us have a hard time admitting to ourselves where we're weak, let alone to others. So our pride and our insecurity, they keep us from admitting our weaknesses, don't they? We don't like being vulnerable. I'll be honest with you. I don't like it at all. But here's the key point. God's grace meets us at our point of vulnerability. If you want to experience God's grace, then you have to be vulnerable. That's a struggle. It's a struggle for me. I'm just being honest with you. I don't like having to say things like, I need help, or I'm having trouble over here. I like saying things like, I'll figure it out. I'll pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I don't like the idea of I'm in over my head, or I don't have what it takes, or I'm not sure what to do next. I like being able to say, hey, I'll figure it out, or I've got a plan, or I've got it figured out. But the truth is, saying difficult words about identifying my weakness, those are words where we learn grace. When I'm required to say those kinds of things like, I'm having a tough time or I need help, that's when the most potential exists to experience God's power in my life. Doesn't it make sense that we would delight in those things? Doesn't it make sense that we would lean into them instead of running away from them? If that's when God is going to show up most prominently, most powerfully? Paul starts off the letter to the church at Corinth, that second letter, 2 Corinthians, in the very first chapter, verse 8. And he says this, we were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure. He goes on in verse 9. As it turned out, it was the best thing that could have happened. Instead of trusting in our own strength, our wits to get out of it, we were forced to trust God totally. And listen to what Paul says. Not a bad idea, since he's the God who raises the dead. So, may you find yourself in a place where the bar is too heavy, where the weight is too much, where the pressure is too intense, and where the struggle is just overwhelming, that you can't do it on your own. And suddenly this default approach that all of us have in trusting ourselves is not going to work for you this time. May that happen to each of us. Because in that moment, as followers of His, at that moment, we will be forced to trust God totally. And that's not a bad idea, as Paul said, to trust a God who raises the dead. So identify your weakness today. Delight in it. Because when we are weak, He is strong. Let's pray. Oh God, thank you. Thank you for being stronger than anything that we will face in this world. Even death, the one thing that is the neutralizer of the rich and the poor, the famous, the unknown, all of us on this planet will face death unless you return. But it's just scheduled for us. King Solomon said we were born, there was a time to be born and a time to die. And so God, we know that we're all going to face that. And yet you are the one who overcomes death. You're the one who raises the dead. God, there's not a thing of weakness that we will face that you cannot give us strength to be successful. So Lord, whether it be in our infirmities or inabilities or insecurities, whatever it is, God, wherever it is that we find our greatest weakness, will you pour your strength in as you promise, and will you show us that even in our worst moment, even in our weakest moment, you're right there with us. Your grace is greater than all of our weaknesses. God, we praise you. We celebrate that, and we ask that you would show that to us even today. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. If you've never taken a step to make Jesus the Lord of your life, we're going to sing a song, And I want to invite you to do that. We've been praying that God would move. He'd bring a harvest, that people in the Hamburg area who don't know Jesus would come to know him. We've been praying for you. Maybe we don't know you by name, but we are praying for you on a regular basis that you would take that step. Maybe today is that day. I'm going to be right down here in the front. If that's a decision in your heart, will you come? Just come down and talk to me. Say, I'm not sure what all this is about. It doesn't matter. We'll help you to take those steps. We just want you to not miss out on the grace of God. Let's stand together and worship. Will you come if you have a decision?